Good morning, church family. It's about time to start. A few weeks ago, we started a class on comparison of the four Gospels to see what we can glean from them when we compare them rather than reading them one at a time. Actually, while I'm doing an introduction, can I get a couple of people to pass out first handout? There'll be a second handout. Thanks, Ross. Be a second handout a little bit later. We started a class on comparing the Gospels, and we talked about the four authors and the four audiences and the author's purpose in writing the Gospels and some literary features, etc., so that we could better get to lay a foundation so we can better understand what we're about to see. And then last week we started with the birth story of Jesus. And we talked about that Mark and John had omitted the birth story from their Gospels, their accounts. And you can speculate as to why, but it appears that in Mark's case, it didn't really fit his purpose. And in John's case, he had Mark's and Luke's manuscripts in front of him, and he probably said, they nailed it, I don't have to cover that part. So we're going to be comparing Matthew and Luke today. We started with Matthew's version last week, and we found that Matthew's account seems to be from Joseph's perspective. So Joseph was likely a person that Matthew interviewed in order to get that account. We also started looking at what I'm going to call the 5 fulfillment passages. That's right here in the first and second chapters of Matthew. So Matthew's starting off in his gospel right from the beginning, trying to prove to his Jewish audience that Jesus is the Messiah that the Old Testament has promised. The handout I'm handing is being passed around now is a comparison of the two birth stories. You don't really need it when we talk about Matthew, but when we get to Luke and we start comparing Luke with Matthew, you'll find that handout to be helpful. So we went through the first 4 of those fulfillment passages, and we noted a pattern. That Matthew would make a statement, and then he would say that that statement fulfills some prophet's prophecy. He would use the word fulfilled, and with one exception, he didn't name the prophet. He expected his audience to know who the prophet was, and then we compared Matthew's statement with what the prophet said, and you could see that there was a match. And that gets us up to, thank you, that gets us up. Anyone else need any handouts? Okay, great. That gets us up to this 5th fulfillment passage. When we got to this last week, I said, I need more time than is available to discuss this, so we'll stop there and pick up there. So this is where we're going to pick up this morning. Morning, Terry. Great. So let's read Matthew's passage. Up on the screen? Yes, good. And this comes from chapter 2, verse 23. And he went and lived in a town called Nazareth. So was fulfilled that what was said through the prophets, that he would be called a Nazarene. Now, the word fulfilled is underlined. That's my underlining. It's not in the scripture. I did that just to emphasize the fulfillment passage. And for the first 4, we compared that with what the prophet said. Thing to note here is that unlike the first 4, where he talked about the prophet, in this case he says the prophets, more than one, it's plural. The second case is when you go to look and find which prophet or prophet said this, you go, nowhere in the Old Testament and nowhere in the Jewish Talmud is there a passage where a prophet says the Messiah is going to be from Nazarene. And in a few minutes I'll discuss why that would have been highly unlikely anyway. But it's not there. You can't find it. So what was Matthew talking about here? and you go look at Bible scholars, and you find maybe 3 or 4 different groups of what they come out of this. Now, the group that I kind of lump together as the Bible critics, those that take every opportunity they can to criticize the Bible, their take on this was, oops, Matthew goofed. There's no doubt there. Obviously, this is an error, and you know, this is just one of many errors that you find out there. Or another alternative is, well, Matthew was better than this, so obviously Matthew didn't write this passage. Someone else wrote this and inserted it in later. Again, you know, another obvious mistake, if you will. Then there's another group of scholars that are not critics, who tend to say something along the lines of, well, this must have been an oral prophecy, and so lots of prophets would have spread this orally. It just wasn't written down, but you know, if we could find, you know, these oral prophecies, it would be there. So, then there's another group that says, well, Matthew didn't mean Nazarene here. He meant Nazarite, like Samson the Nazarite. And okay, could be interesting, except that there's nothing in Jesus' life that would indicate that he was a Nazarite. In fact, if you sit there and study it carefully, there's plenty in his life that would indicate he was not a Nazarite. So there's no real rational basis for you to think that this is what Matthew's trying to say. So if you go to Messianic Jewish scholars, now these are people who are both Jewish and believe that Jesus is the Messiah, so they know their Old Testament, they know Jewish background, Jewish customs, Jewish laws, etc., and they know their New Testament. They look at this and it's a completely different reaction. It's, wow, Matthew is a genius. He is brilliant. He's done something here that it would take you know, a genius to figure out. And in fact, I'll give a clue here. This is a double entendre. A double entendre is a phrase that can have 2 meanings, both of which are accurate. And this is the Jewish take on this passage. So let's go through the first entendre, if you will, and then we'll go through the second one. And let's start with Isaiah chapter 9, verses 1 through 6. I got verses 1 and 2 on the slide up there, but before I talk about verses 1 and 2, I want to mention verse 6 because it's one you probably know off the top of your head. You hear a bit every Christmas, especially if you listen to Charlie Brown's Christmas. Linus is up there and he tells you, unto us is born a child, unto us is born a son. Sound familiar? Obviously a messianic phrase. So let's look at verses 1 and 2 and see what Isaiah has to say. In the past he humbled the land of Zebulun and the land of Naphtali, but in the future he will honor Galilee of the nations, by the sea, beyond the Jordan. Some people take that as one phrase. I take it as 3 separate phrases. The people walking in darkness have seen a great light. And then verses 2 and 3 go on to talk about, I didn't have room up there to put all of 2 and all of 3, but it go on talking about how this light is going to shine throughout all of Galilee and beyond into the Jordan. Now, does that sound familiar? The light being the truth, or the gospel being shined throughout Galilee, and Matthew could easily see that comparison. But where is Nazarene or Nazareth in that phrase? It's not listed there anywhere. How do we get to that? And to do that, we got to go through Jewish history, a long piece of Jewish history, and talk about that. I hope that's big enough you can see it. We need to go back 1,400 years before Christ. Israel left Egypt They wandered around the desert for 40 years. They came into the promised land, and they conquered it, and that is very well described in Joshua. And maps like this come from Joshua's description of how that land was conquered, and specifically where each tribe settled in that at that time. So 1,400 years before Christ, this is the northern part of Israel. This little blue speck right here, if you will, is the Sea of Galilee. This blue line down here is the Jordan, the River Jordan. And you can see the land of Zebulun. This is where the tribe of Zebulun settled, and the land of Naphtali, and there's some others there. But of interest to this particular prophet are these two areas right here. Now, this is 1400 BC. Isaiah is the one that made this prophecy, and he's talking at around 742 BC. So almost 700 years after the tribe settled into this area. Isaiah is making a prophecy, and he's making references to what happened 700 years ago, and he's going to apply it to something that's going to happen 700 years in the future. It's kind of interesting. But again, where does Nazareth come into this picture? I got interested at this point as to, was Nazareth even a Jewish settlement at the time of Isaiah? When did Nazareth actually become a Jewish settlement? So I went into archaeological journals, and in fact, there was a nice article published just this last July, which confirmed what I had found earlier, and that is Nazareth wasn't a Jewish settlement until approximately 100 BC. Now, 100 BC is about the time that the Greeks under Alexander the Great were in control of this region, and the Greeks were doing a lot of building. By the way, this article and several others point out that Nazareth is both an agricultural center, but it's also a construction center. There apparently are several large limestone quarries in and around the area of Nazareth. So what a great place for a father-son carpenter team to be than a site where a lot of construction's going on. The Greeks did a lot of construction using those quarries, and then 40 years later, when the Romans came in, they continued using those quarries to do the construction that they wanted to do. So Nazareth comes in about 100 BC, and so this is a map of Nazareth at about 30 AD, about the time of Christ. And again, I want you to note, this is the Sea of Galilee. This is the Sea of Galilee. This is Nazareth. And I want you to note that Nazareth lies right on the border of Zebulun and Naphtali. So let's back up. I'm sorry, I went forward. In the past, he humbled the land of Zebulun and the land of Naphtali, but in the future, he will honor Galilee of the nations by the sea, beyond the Jordan. The people walking in darkness have seen a great light. You see where Nazareth comes from now in this prophecy? Had to work through it, but this land of Naphtali and Zebulun is right where Nazareth is. So you can see where Matthew could have gotten this from. And that leads to the question, did Matthew even understand this? I mean, you have to go through a little bit here to get there. And the passage that we read, Matthew's passage that we read, comes from chapter 2, verse 23. Matthew himself, 2 chapters later, in chapter 4, at about the point in the story where Jesus is leaving Nazareth and going to Capernaum, makes that statement there. In the past, he humbled the land of Zebulun and the land of, not that statement. Leaving Nazareth, he went and lived in Capernaum, which was by the lake in the area of Zebulun and Naphtali, to fulfill what was said through the prophet Isaiah. And then he goes on to quote Isaiah 9, verses 1 through 6. So yes, Matthew clearly understood this prophecy. He talks about it twice, once in chapter 2, once in chapter 4, and he clearly links it to Jesus coming from Nazareth and going into Galilee. So Matthew understood that, and he's referencing Isaiah 9, at least as part of the first entendre, if you will. So I alluded that this was a double entendre. There's two meanings here. To get to the second meaning, we got to look at several different prophecies. We're going to look at Isaiah chapter 11, Jeremiah 23, Jeremiah 33, Zechariah 3, and Zechariah chapter 6. First off, Isaiah 11. A shoot will come up from the stump of Jesse. From his roots, a branch will bear fruit. Two things I want you to note about that. First off, the bold is me. I did that. But you notice the branch is capitalized. I did not do that. That's in the text. It's a proper name. It's intended to be a proper name. From his roots, a branch will bear fruit. That's Isaiah 11. Jeremiah 23. The days are coming, declares the Lord, when I will raise up for David a righteous branch, a king who, and it goes on and talks about what he's, I didn't have room to put the whole thing up there. Again, branch, I bolded it, but the capital B is there. This is intended to be a proper name. Jeremiah 33. I will make a righteous branch sprout from David's line. He will do what is just and right in the land. Again, the B is capitalized in the text. That wasn't me. And then let's go to Zechariah. Zechariah 3. I'm going to bring my servant the branch. Again, the B is capitalized. And then Zechariah 3 chapters later. Here is the man whose name is the branch, and he will. So if there's any question about this being a name, Zechariah clears it up. We talked about the history, Naphtali, Zebulun, about 1400 BC. Isaiah did his prophesying about 740, 742-ish. Jeremiah is about 600 or so BC, and Zechariah is in the 500s BC. So all of this is clearly, 500 plus years prior to Christ. All of these names, or all of these verses have branch as a proper name in common. But how does that get us to Nazareth or Nazarene? Well, it turns out branch in Hebrew is Nazar. Nazar is the root word for Nazarene. And I have the Jewish writing, maybe hard for you to see in the back, but if you compare Nazar and Nazarene when written in Hebrew, there's one letter difference. So Jewish scholars take this to mean that this is a pun, and that Paul is clearly saying that the prophets are saying that he would be called a Nazarene, he would be called the branch. Any questions there before I move on? Okay. So we talked about 5 fulfillment passages, and again, this just wanted to pause here to say Matthew is working very hard right in the first and the second chapter to start proving that Jesus is the promised Messiah. So let's look at Luke's version of the story. And I've got it on the next 2 slides. I'll read it to you. In the 6th month of Elizabeth's pregnancy, God sent the angel Gabriel to Nazareth, a town in Galilee, to a virgin pledged to be married to a man named Joseph, a descendant of David. The virgin's name was Mary. The angel went to her and said, "Greetings, you who are highly favored. The Lord is with you." Mary was greatly troubled at his words and wondered what kind of greeting this might be. But the angel said to her, "Do not be afraid, Mary. You have found favor with God. You will conceive and give birth to a son, and you are to call him Jesus. He will be great and will be called the Son of the Most High. The Lord God will give him the throne of his father David, and he will reign over Jacob's descendants forever. His kingdom will never end." "How will this be?" Mary asked the angel, "since I am a virgin?" The angel answered, "The Holy Spirit will come on you, and the power of the Most High will overshadow you. So the Holy One to be born will be called the Son of God. Even Elizabeth, your relative, is going to have a child in her old age, and she who was said to be unable to conceive in her 6th month, for no word from God will ever fail." "I am the Lord's servant," Mary answered. "May your word to me be fulfilled." Then the angel left her. So let's look at that a little closer. This may be where you might find that handout useful. Matthew's version appears to have been told from Joseph's perspective. I contend that this version, Luke's version, is being told from Mary's perspective. Why? Well, it tells of an angel talking to Mary, but there's no mention of an angel talking to Joseph, and we heard that last week. It records Mary's thoughts, but it doesn't record Joseph's thoughts like we heard last week. And it tells of an angelic dream that Mary had, but there's no discussion of an angelic dream that Joseph had like we discussed last week. So clearly this is being told from Mary's perspective, and it's likely that Mary was one of the witnesses Luke talked about that he interviewed for this story. In addition to that, in a few minutes, we're going to talk about a genealogy that Luke put together. And this also, I'm kind of giving away a secret here, this also appears to have been told from Mary's perspective. And last but not least, on this part of it, Matthew talked about Jesus being visited by the Magi, royalty. Luke doesn't mention the royalty at all. But he does mention that Jesus is being visited by shepherds. Why would you suppose Matthew do one thing and Luke would do another? So clearly in the case of Matthew, a visit to Jesus by royalty is an indication that Jesus was royalty, and that fits his purpose of trying to prove that Jesus is the promised Messiah. In Luke's case, he's not trying to prove to the Jews anything necessarily, but throughout his gospel, he is demonstrating Christ's humanity over and over and over again. And what a better way to show the humanity than having a visit by a group of caring and loving shepherds. Food for thought. In addition, you may recall Matthew talked about a trip to Egypt and back. Luke, in his version of the trip home, he talks about them visiting the temple at Jerusalem. This appears to be in order to fulfill the purity rites or purification rites that's associated with childbirth. And you can read all about those purification rites in Leviticus 12. But of note here are these 4 points. After the birth, there's, regardless of whether it's male or female, there are 7 days of ritual uncleanliness, in which case on day 8, if it's a boy, the boy is to be circumcised. And then if it's a girl, you go on, well, for a boy or a girl, you go on for another 33 days of ritual cleanliness before you visit or do anything. Therefore, Mary would not have taken this trip to go to Jerusalem any earlier than 42 days after the birth. It could be later, but no earlier than 42 days. Why would I bother making that point? There's time there for Mary and Joseph to go off to Egypt if need be and come back. So you hear people go, these two stories are inconsistent. I'm telling you, no, they're not inconsistent. They could both equally be, but they both are equally true, and there is time here. She didn't have to go there at day 43. She could have gone there on day 60. She would be ceremoniously unclean during that time, but she certainly couldn't go there before day 42. And then at the end of this, the purification rites, then you would sacrifice a lamb and a dove, or a pigeon, a bird, a lamb and a bird, or if you are unable to afford the lamb, you could sacrifice 2 birds. And Luke tells us this was 2 birds in the case of Jesus. So that's there in Luke's version, not in Matthew's version. But there's also these 2 proclamations that occur in Jerusalem. And you may remember the phrase that Mary wondered and pondered about these things, clearly again from Mary's perspective. And those 2 proclamations were one by Simeon, and Luke tells us it's via the Holy Spirit. And Simeon refers to Jesus as a light for revelation to the Gentiles and glory of your people Israel. So Luke here, again, near the very beginning of his gospel, he's starting to point towards how Jesus is there not just for the Jews, but he's also there for the Gentiles. And then there's a second proclamation there by Anna. You may recall her, the long-standing widow who stood by the temple for decades. And she refers to Jesus as the redemption of Jerusalem. I have a map here. I wanted to give you a sense of what this travel would look like. And unfortunately, this is very difficult to read, even from here. I can't imagine how difficult it is to read from the back, but I will point out, this is Jerusalem here, Bethlehem here. It's about 8 miles, and I've been there. It's about 8 miles from Bethlehem to Jerusalem. It's an uphill walk from Bethlehem to Jerusalem, but a couple in their early 20s could easily do that in about 3 hours. So this is a very manageable, I won't call it easy, but it's a very manageable trip to do in a half a day to get from Bethlehem to Jerusalem. Okay, so this is Jerusalem, and this is Nazareth up here. To go through that in the most direct route, you have to go through Samaria, and that's a hilly route, up and down, up and down. You have to go through Samaria, so that's an issue, but not unsurmountable. It's being done daily by Jews in that time frame, and that's about an 8-day trip. And again, a couple in their early 20s could easily manage this in 8 days. In fact, they could do it faster if they intended to do it faster. But you probably wouldn't want to do it the fast route if you're carrying a baby and other things along with you. We're going to see this is what I call the cartoon map. We're going to see maps like this throughout the course. And I think understanding the geography is important in understanding the underlying stories. Okay, let's switch gears now. We'll stop at the birth stories and start talking about genealogy. So it'd be a good time to ask 1 or 2 questions if there are any. Okay, either I've completely clearly stated everything here or I've completely confused you. I'm not sure which one. But we'll move on. Both Matthew and Luke present genealogies of Jesus. They do it differently. Luke traces genealogy all the way back to Adam. That's quite a feat if you think about it. Matthew traces the genealogy back to Abraham, and he omits any generations before Abraham. Now, if you think about what Matthew's purpose is, he's trying to prove that Jesus is the Messiah that's been promised by the Old Testament. At a minimum, he's got to take it all the way back to David. Taking it back to Abraham, the father of the Hebrew nation, is a good thing. Going all the way back to Adam doesn't really help him prove his point. Getting it to David, going to Abraham. David is the must. Abraham is a good thing. Anything beyond that's not really necessary for his purpose. Luke, though, is demonstrating Jesus' humanity. So taking this genealogy all the way back to Adam just goes to prove just how human Jesus is. So Matthew and Luke have these genealogies. Turns out the Old Testament lists a bunch of Hebrew genealogies as well. So it's natural to say, okay, how do the genealogies that Matthew and Luke provide at, roughly 50, 60 AD, how do they compare to the genealogies that go back to, let's say, 1400 BC? And let's start with Luke, because Luke goes all the way back to Adam. Luke's genealogy from Adam to Abraham is very consistent with the Old Testament, with one exception. Oh, I'm sorry. I said there'd be a second handout. And if I could get someone on both sides. Okay. Thank you. I want to take one look at it real quick. 13. When you get the handout, if you take a look at line 13, you'll see Canaan there in Luke's genealogy. Interesting point about this is that while Canaan is part of Luke's genealogy in most modern versions of Luke, it's not in any modern version of the Old Testament. And it's not in any Hebrew version of the Old Testament. In fact, it appears to have popped up in the Septuagint. The Septuagint is a Greek version of the Old Testament that was prepared. You probably have heard this story many times. 72 Jewish rabbi, supposedly 6 from each tribe, got together in Alexandria, Egypt, at the request of the Greek Egyptian Pharaoh. Yeah, I think there's should be more than enough. So take some over there and pass them this way, that would help. Where was I? Septuagint. Group of 70 Jewish scholars got together to translate the Hebrew Old Testament into Greek for Greek scholars. Actually, on behalf of the Greek Egyptian Pharaoh, Ptolemy. And that occurred between about, if my dating is correct, somewhere around 250 through about 150 BC, was because they weren't done all at once. The books were done over time, and then they were transcribed in order to keep them available throughout the years. And somewhere around 220 AD, Canaan pops up in the Septuagint, and he pops up in Luke's versions of the manuscripts. Now, third bullet down there, the third sub-bullet of the third bullet down, is it up the screen? Yes, it is. Turns out that the two versions of the Luke manuscript that we have today that date back to about 175 AD, in other words, date back before this error pops up in the Septuagint, those versions of Luke do not have Canaan in it. In addition, there are some secular writings, one from Eusebius and one from Africanus, that date back prior to 220 AD, that have both the Septuagint and Luke references in those documents, and neither one of them have Canaan in it as well. So logically, it appears that Canaan pops in somewhere around 220 AD. It's a translational error, and it's still there today. I'm not sure why scholars haven't popped it out yet. But rest assured, it's most likely a translational error. Has no impact on the rest of the story. So that is Luke from Adam to Abraham, very consistent with one exception. Then if you look at Abraham to King David, you now have a Matthew version, a Luke version, and the Old Testament version, and they are also very consistent, as you can see on the handout. So now we go from King David to Joseph. And right off the bat, you will notice that not only are there some differences, it is completely different from David to Jesus. Completely different. Matthew lists Joseph's father as Jacob and then traces his lineage back to David's son Solomon, whereas Luke lists Joseph's father as Heli and traces his lineage back to David's son Nathan. One thing to point out here, in both of those genealogies, there is an adoption involved. In Matthew's version, Jesus has been adopted by Joseph. And in Luke's version, Joseph has been adopted by Heli. It appears that Heli is the father of Mary. And if you go look at John, in passages we talked about a couple of weeks ago, John mentions that Mary has a sister. So Heli had two daughters, Mary and the sister of Mary. No mention of any son whatsoever. According to Mosaic law, and there's a reference, I think it's footnote 4 on your spreadsheet there. According to Mosaic law, if a man has only daughters and has no sons, then he can adopt as a son for legal purposes, particularly for inheritance purposes, the son that marries his daughter or his son-in-law. So he may have been born of one man, but for legal purposes is the son of another man. Does that make sense? So this appears as what Luke is getting at in his version. I asked a question, why the difference, but let's move on. Oh, I didn't bring that up. Sorry. Let's go on and I'll come back to why the difference. Now, Luke doesn't mention any women in the genealogy of Jesus. He doesn't even mention Mary at this point in the genealogy. Matthew mentions 4 or 5 women, depending on how you want to count it, in the genealogy of Jesus. Both of these are unusual. Luke goes out of his way throughout the rest of his gospel to point out every time Jesus has an interaction with a woman to show the humanity that he has towards women. So why didn't he do it there? Not clear. On the other hand, on Matthew's side, it is highly unusual for a Hebrew genealogy to list any women whatsoever unless there was something special about that woman. You'll see that in Chronicles. Occasionally a woman, a sister will be mentioned if there was something special about that sister. So it's of interest to see why, or to ask the question, why would Matthew mention these 4 women? Well, who were they? In verse 3, it's Tamar, mother of Perez. And if you go to Genesis 38, what do we know about Tamar? We know that she was a Gentile, and we know that she was accused of incest and deceit. The next one is Rahab, the mother of Boaz. And if you go back to Joshua chapters 2 and chapter 6, we found out that she's also a Gentile, and she was a prostitute. Next is Ruth, the mother of Obed. She was a Gentile, and you can read all about Ruth in Ruth. And then there was Bathsheba, mother of Solomon, or as typically written, wife of Uriah. She was a Gentile, and she was an adulteress. Again, you reference there is 2 Samuel So what do those 4 women have in common? They're all Gentiles, and they are all guilty of some sin. Well, we're all Gentiles, and we're all guilty of sin too. So why weren't we mentioned in that? Why these women? It appears that these are all women that were shown grace by God, and Matthew wanted to point that out for whatever reason. Well, I really wanted to finish this today, but I got 3 more slides, so I'm not going to be able to. So we will stop here, and we will start on that slide when we come back next week. Thank you. Any questions? I got 2 minutes for questions.